The US election is in 2 more days, on November 3rd, and we're seeing millions of US citizens exercising their right to vote in advance. But why should you vote? And why does the South Asian vote matter? I'm joined today by fellow Zoroastrian Ava Damri, who will provide a brief explanation of voting in the US, the importance of the South Asian vote, and how you can get more involved as an informed citizen. Ava Damri is a member of the Zoroastrian Association of North Texas and a Zoroastrian Return to Roots 5 alumna. She grew up in many cities worldwide, such as Miami, Mumbai, and Auckland, but now she calls Dallas-Fort Worth, Texas, her home. One of Ava's passions is civic engagement, which she currently channels through her role as a board member for Wise Up TX, a nonpartisan nonprofit empowering and educating Texas South Asians to be informed voters and partake in civic engagement. She developed her interest in current events and a passion for social justice by listening to podcasts. While Ava has voted in all major US elections since she turned 18, she had her civics awakening in 2018 when she took an active role in her local community by volunteering for candidates, becoming a deputy voter registrar, and taking a leadership role as a precinct chair within her local county. When Ava isn't geeking out over elections, she works as a human capital consultant at Deloitte Consulting. And in her leisure time, she loves reading British mysteries, consuming high tea, and using her business skills to support local nonprofits. Needless to say, a very impressive career to date, and I'm so excited to have her join us today. I'm just going to have her join. Thank you, everybody, for attending. Hi.
Hello.
Thank you so much for joining today.
Thank you for having me.
Of
Sorry,
course.
this is now
It's totally fine.
technology.
I'm so excited that people are joining and very engaged in today's topic. Thank you so much for your time. And I want to just jump right into it. I'm hoping that we can kind of teach people, perhaps the Zoroastrians who are new to the US or considering immigrating to the US, just tell them kind of a brief history of voting in the United States, and we'll go from there.
Sure. So I think a lot of people are familiar with the idea that initially most countries, men were given the right to vote first. Women were given the right to vote in the US in the 1920s. But South Asians weren't actually allowed to vote until the 1950s. And finally, it wasn't even solidified probably until 1965, which was when our Voting Rights Act was passed. And so it opened up voting for not just white men or white women, it opened it up for minorities across the board. And so that is a motivating factor in itself. Like, there are obviously people who could not vote for a long time.
Yeah.
Also, the US electoral system has made elections a very interesting setup. So US is one of the few democracies that has an electoral college, which basically means that while there are people who are voting, individuals are voting, that's the popular vote, each state in this country designates electors who are supposed to give them the sort of the extra power to actually vote for the president. When this constitution was set up, the men who created it were like, well, we can't trust just the regular old Joe to vote for a president. This is very important. They're not necessarily educated enough. And so we want to have this like extra layer, which has actually turned into quite a controversial thing now. And so that has led to a lot of situations where the person who wins the popular vote doesn't necessarily win the presidential election. And every state in this country does their own thing with elections. So I live in Texas, as you mentioned. I'm most familiar with Texas politics, but every state in this country does things a little bit differently. So if you're new to the country and you're trying to figure out what's going on, it can be a little challenging because it's maybe not as straightforward, but every county and every state has an elections commission, and they're the ones who govern the process.
Okay.
So that's sort of a very high level overview of voting in this country.
I mean, it's interesting because I'm Canadian, so I have no idea. Roughly, I have like a kind of small idea, but I have heard that it is different per state, which is very interesting because for us, it's kind of just countrywide. There's a standard, so I think that's really cool, and I think it's important for people to know as well, especially when they're considering a specific state to move to be aware of how it forms its regulations for voting. So then let's get into it. Why is it important to vote? Why does it matter? I feel like a lot of people might not be aware, especially if they're planning on moving and might not be involved in politics. So just kind of letting them know why it's important in general.
Yeah. So, I mean, I like to think about voting as like, would you want to hand over your autonomy for what you wear, what you eat, how you drive, where you live to somebody else? Because if you do, then don't bother to vote. But otherwise, voting has a very important relevance on your life. And I know we focus on the presidential election all the time because that's, especially from a global perspective, that's what the world sees. However, local elections actually have a lot more say on your life. So, like, do you care about your property taxes? Do you care about your child's education? Do you care about the safety of your family? All of that actually happens at the local level. And so,
Mm-hmm.
if you want to have a say in your life and your state of affairs, your money, your life, everything, like voting is the way to do it. I mean, the reason people have come to this country for generations, especially ones that have chosen to come here, I should be clarified, we have a long history of slavery. Um, you're coming here to improve and make your life better. How else
Mm-hmm.
can you do that if you don't contribute to the country in which you've now moved to? If you abdicate that right and you don't vote, eventually, if everyone does that, then there's no one's actually tending to democracy. Democracy does die if you don't do anything with it. It's like a plant or a
Mm-hmm.
human.
Exactly.
So I think if you care enough about what car you drive or where you live, you should definitely care about voting and being involved at, at every level and that doesn't necessarily mean you're like super involved in like every candidate's life. That just means that you take an active role to figure out what people are out there, what their policy and platforms are, and how they affect your life, and you make a decision or you ask for help. Like
Mm-hmm.
voting can be complicated. It's not easy for everyone to just read something and understand it, but it is important that you care enough to make that effort.
And I think that's a key thing is like asking for help if you don't know. I mean, there's so many great organizations. You're part of one that kind of educates you and empowers you to make your vote. That way you're not having to worry about going through like, just the internet in general and trying to find the resource that's probably accurate. So I'm curious now, like, what are some reliable sources of information that people can
Yeah,
look towards or any kind of resource to help them out?
sure. So I'll be amiss if I don't talk about my organization, but mine is focused on Texas. So I'm part of a group called Wise Up TX. They started in 2016, and we're made up of South Asians from all over the globe, basically. So I'm the only Zoroastrian representation, but we have Pakistanis, Bangladeshis, Sri Lankans, Nepalis, people from Hindu, Christian, Muslim, different faiths. And we're all very excited and enthusiastic about the civic process. And so we have voter guides, we have information on ballots, we do podcasts with candidates. And so and we're a nonpartisan organization, so we do
Hmm.
not um, promote any one candidate or party. But in addition to that, all over the country, there's a group called the League of Women Voters, which
Hmm.
is also another nonpartisan organization, which can give you tips on who's on your ballot, what are their policies. Then I would also, one of the other sort of media organizations that I would like to specifically call out is it's called The Correspondent.
Okay.
It's a ad-free uh, print journalism, started originally in the Netherlands, and they have opened up in the US as well.
Hmm.
The reason I promote them is because they don't take money for ads, they're not trying to sensationalize the news.
Okay.
And I think right now with this era of misinformation in the internet, I'd be wary about what you're trusting as a reliable source of information. Generally, I would put print journalism over television,
Hmm.
but even in print, obviously, you need to be careful. Um, and I don't necessarily think bias, quote unquote, is bad. I think you just want to make sure that the sources of information and the facts that are being provided are reliable. And generally, you get that with the larger print organizations because their whole process is really robust and fact checking. So the Guardian, the New York Times, some of the BBC, like other like, and don't just focus on I think US based. I think it's a global view is very important because that's how you know when other people in the world
Yeah.
also think of what's going on in the country.
No, I think that's really well said. To get that global view as well is so important. Thank you everybody for joining. Again, if you have any questions, please write them and we'll definitely get to them while we're doing this talk. One other organization I'd love to give a shout out to is called Chalo Vote, and they're on Instagram, and they're also a nonprofit organization that empowers South Asian Americans to vote. And they're a great supporter of Fazana, so I'd love to give them a little shout out.
Yes, yes, you're right.
Who did
Mhm.
uh, he did a spot for them specifically.
Oh, okay. So
So
another
another
question I
question I
have
have
is
is
about the
about the
power of
power
the
of the
South
South
Asian
Asian
vote.
vote.
My sound seems to have gone out.
Oh,
Can you hear me?
yeah, you're good.
Okay.
I can't hear myself anymore, which is good. But I wanted to get to the South Asian vote, which I know is a lot of Zoroastrians are South Asian, and a lot of them are coming from somewhere in Asia, coming to the US, and just kind of reminding them the importance of the South Asian vote in the US.
Yeah, so the Pew Research has found that the South Asians and just the Asian American community as a whole is one of the largest growing ethnic groups in the US electorate
Mhm.
specifically. And from 2000 to 2020, the number of Asian American eligible voters has more than doubled. So the, they are taking notice. Like this
Mhm.
year, especially, I've noticed that they're not also just looking at South Asians as a monolith, like all South Asians. It's like, oh, what are the Pakistanis or the Bangladeshis or the Muslims or the Hindus? Like they are actually organizations are targeting the specific populations. I know in North Texas, where I live, the Muslim groups are doing have been coming out and doing their own get out the vote efforts. The Hindu groups are doing that, and so I think that the fact that or candidates and parties and just overall all these nonprofits that have popped up realize that they need to like actively seek out the South Asian vote. We even have
Mhm.
several South Asian candidates that have taken more notice across the country. And so South Asians actually have quite a bit of power in how they vote. And so they are starting to look at them. And I think we shouldn't forget that. And I know a lot of the times people that have immigrated, they tend to keep sort of their politics from their home country sometimes can weigh a lot in on how they think about US politics. And I think while there's definitely some element of that, there should be also a fresh look at where you're living and what your institution is instead of just saying all politics are bad. Because
Mhm.
honestly, staying away from politics is really not an option because you as a human being live in a country, you are going to be affected by those policies, whether you choose to actively pay attention to them or not.
100% agree. I think it's so important. Like even for me, when I turned 18, I felt like I really got more involved because I started realizing, hey, these policies actually do affect me and affect the way I work, the way I live.
Mhm.
And I have, like it's my duty to be involved and be aware. Thank you. So one other question I had was just in some ways, like what are ways people can get involved even if they're not able to vote? And then what are some expectations people can have for election day?
Yeah, so all great questions. So ways to get involved. So I know we have our folks who are eligible to vote and they've already voted, and maybe that's all they can do. There are people who are not able to vote for various reasons. They can get, especially if you speak another language. There are places that are looking for language resources. If you can drive people to the polls, you don't have to be an eligible voter to drive someone to the polls.
Hmm.
There's an organization that's called South Asians Vote. That's the whole term, South Asians Vote,
Yeah.
and they have resources on there of how you can get involved. And if you can't do any of those things, you can at least encourage your family and friends to vote. And this comes from people that are not living in the States. I mean, if you're living abroad and you have family in the US, maybe you should ask them, have they voted?
Yeah.
Because if they start hearing it from people all over, it's more likely that they're going to, like the greatest way that we've seen that people actually turn out to vote is they have someone in their life that is telling them they need to vote, and they're not just hearing it from media and external organizations. Um, and then also to keep in mind, there are future elections. So if you can't vote in this election or if you can't get involved in this election, um, every year this country has some form of election. So we have a local, county, city council elections. We will have every 2 years we have our sort of our House of Representatives and Senate elections, even if we don't, it's like the midterms, as we call them in the States. So all of those things are out there. So like, don't just think this is the one election and then I'm done. You need to
Hmm.
continually hold your elected officials accountable. You are the ones who are electing them. They report to you. And I
Yeah.
think we forget that
We
we're
do.
technically their boss. And so keeping all of that in mind. Additionally, for in terms of expectations, um, I would be amiss to not mention the fact that we're in the middle of a pandemic has made things a little bit more complicated. And each state, as I mentioned earlier, does their own thing with policies around voting. And so some states have decided to expand mail in ballots, for example. So some of the swing states, quote unquote, swing states are the ones that kind of don't know how they're going to vote eventually, because they have
Hmm.
a reasonable mixed population of people that vote for different parties. So like your Michigans, your Pennsylvania, your Wisconsin, some of them will not start counting ballots until the day of the election. Some of them will start counting ballots in advance. Some of them, we also have different time zones. So we have our Californias and our Washington states who are on the West Coast,
Hmm.
and their polls close at a different hour. So because of all of these different influences and different times and things like that, you're going to have a situation where the election results are just not going to be the night of. Some election results will be. So for the state of Texas, we decided not to expand mail-in voting, which means most of our voting is going to be done electronically, which means we probably will have results for our local elections, our state elections, and even maybe even our presidential elections. But that doesn't, that doesn't tell you the full results. So the expectation going into this election is do not expect results to come out at the end of the night. And honestly, this is not just for this year. Like there are states that have been doing mail-in ballots consistently, like California and Washington, who all of their counting happens after the fact. So you're not going to find out for a few more days. What we
Oh,
don't
okay.
want happening is a 2000 situation, which was a Bush v. Gore, where it took almost over a month to get our results in.
A month,
Hopefully that,
really? Oh
yeah.
my
So,
gosh.
and then Supreme Court had to make the decision. So we
Wow.
genuinely do not want to be in that situation, because it's fraught for everyone. It's fraught for the world. It's fraught for the citizens. And so that I will say that is something to just keep in mind. And finally, I also would like to given that the November 3rd election day is coming up, there might be some people here who haven't yet voted. Make sure you're voting the entire ballot, up and down the ballot, because you're not just voting for president. The president does not actually have as direct impact on your life as your local judge or your city council person or your mayor. And sometimes you think, oh my God, my ballot is long. My ballot was 39. I think I had 39 things to vote for in my ballot.
Wow. Oh my gosh.
So it's very important that you vote the entire ballot, because those are the people that are going to affect your lives.
That's really well said. It's incredible to see like how different voting is for the states versus Canada. Even though we're right next to each other, our voting systems are very different. So if I was to move to the states and have the right to vote there, I would be completely shocked if I didn't know in advance what to expect.
Yeah,
So like if I saw 39 things to vote for, I'd be like, oh, I didn't
it's
realize I have to
intimidating.
know all
It's
this.
very
Oh yeah.
intimidating. I'll just tell a cute story. I think it's kind of funny given a lot of our speakers are Gujarati speaking.
Yeah.
I worked the ballots or the polls before. This is the first year I'm actually not because of COVID, but
Hmm.
in the 2018 election, I know people know that in the state of Texas, one of the candidates that was running, his nickname was Beto, and a Gujarati speaking couple came in to vote, and the wife was trying to tell the husband who to vote for, but they were speaking Gujarati, and so they were saying Beto ne vote karje. So like they were saying it like son, which is a word for Beto in the Gujarati pronunciation, and I was like, wow, there were actually quite a few different South Asians that came in to vote, and I think that because of that, and this year, and I live in a neighborhood actually, it has a lot of Nepalis.
Hmm.
And so I have seen that the vast variety of South Asians, and they're not a monolith. We vote for all different races, also parties. So
Hmm.
I think that is something to just keep in mind, that you might feel like you're getting intimidated, but you can't ask for help. There are language resources out there. There are voter protection resources out there. If nothing else, you guys can go to wiseuptx.org. And even if you're not in Texas, we can help guide you to the right resources for your state. I think it is very important to ask for help. It is very important to exercise your right to vote, or to help others exercise their right to vote.
I completely agree. I think it's so amazing that we have these resources that probably weren't there in the past, or at least people weren't aware, but with social media, you can be more aware of it now. I think that's amazing. We have another question here. They're asking, how does the US elections results make an impact on Canadian politics? Do you
No,
have
that's
any
a.
idea?
I mean, I can speak to it generally. I am not
Mhm.
I'm not a political science person personally, but
Yeah.
I mean, pretty much U.S. elections has an impact on the entire world. I mean, I know some people are like, "Oh, U.S. has a really big head," but it does. You've seen it over the years, and so I do know. I've heard. I think your prime minister has actually said that we are going to prepare for regardless of whatever the results
Hmm.
are. But one of the most probably direct examples is what used to be NAFTA and now is the USMCA, whatever our trade agreement is.
Hmm.
Depending on the presidential politics, depending on the congressional politics, so our Senate, our House of Representatives, has a direct impact on how we handle trade
Okay.
in Canada. Also can impact immigration policies. It can impact the border or how we sort of handle our border relations between US and Canada. Export import is probably the most directive way, but there are probably other smaller ways that I think, and I know that I feel like all the countries, like Mexico and Canada, are also on the edge to see what comes out of these results.
I think that's like important thing to remember. I know sometimes people are like, oh, stay out of it. You're Canadian, but it's like, hey, like we have to give you the like US is a powerhouse. Like whether some people acknowledge it or not, you are. So, you directly affect many countries. So being your allies, being next door, whatever your results are also affects us as well. Whoever leads your country affects us as well.
Mm-hmm.
So I think it's important that, if you have US relatives, or if you're in the US and you have Canadian relatives, chat with each other, and talk about these politics. Arzan's in the audience, and he's asking, how about the amazing idea implemented by Texas, drive-in vote, which is now being challenged?
Yeah, I would say I'll amaze. The guy that is running that is my age.
Okay.
I'm 34. I was like, what is he doing? I'm like amazed by his name is Chris Collins. He's the Texas, the Houston elections commissioner.
Okay.
And he was like, Houston had faced a lot of problems with voting. I think in 2018, people were waiting in lines for like 8 hours, 10 hours, 16 hours to vote. And so he came along and he tried to make things easier, and which we've noticed that the numbers have definitely gone up in Harris County. And yes, as of in the last couple of days, the the process of drive-in voting is being challenged in the courts to say that anyone who voted through drive-through voting, that those votes shouldn't be counted. However, we do have things like disabled voting in the state where people can. It's kind of like drive-through voting, and it has been legal for a long time now, where you set up a little button outside the polling station, and it presses like a little doorbell, and somebody from the inside will bring out the voting machine to your car so that you can vote. So what I don't understand is if that is legal, why drive-through voting wouldn't be, because they should be following all the same procedures.
And is that just to make it more accessible? Like
it's to make it more accessible. It's also just to keep it safer, right? So you're not exposed to more people than you need to be. Back when COVID first began in this country, or at least when the US started taking notice of it, we were still in our primary season, which meant some states were still voting in the middle of COVID. And for example, I believe Illinois and Wisconsin went through with their primaries right when COVID was like really starting up, and people have died from that. Like people that weren't taking precautions that went and voted in those elections have since died. And so we knew going into the November election that we had to, every place, every city, every state, every county had to do something to make sure that they were trying to be as safe as possible. My county doesn't have drive-through voting, but we have set up, where I voted was a large auditorium. So I felt like there was a lot of space, people wearing masks. They were using Purell. I wore gloves and I used a stylus to vote because my county my state did not expand did not expand mail-in ballots, which is why we had drive-through voting.
Okay. Well, I hope everyone stays safe while they are voting, if they haven't voted in advances yet. Any final words, Ava? Thank you again so much for your time and for your knowledge today as well.
Yeah, no, this is definitely a passion of mine. So if people have questions after the fact, I would love to be able to answer them if they want to channel them through Fazana or directly through my profile. I would also like to make a quick plug for my nonprofit in this chai that we're selling right now. We got a special blend it's called Civics and Chai, and one of the things we love to do, especially pre-COVID, was get together over chai and talk about politics. So if anybody's interested in buying this, if you go to wiseuptx.org/shop, we are selling them, and they help support our nonprofit and all the content that we create throughout the year.
Thank you, Ava. So for me, final words is just really like Ava said. Please do go out and vote. Remember, your vote matters. Don't trick anyone into telling you that your vote doesn't count. It is so important. So if you haven't already, please be safe while you're doing so, but do ensure that you practice your right to vote if you are in the U.S. And even if you're around the world, whenever election time does come, be involved. Look at the resources available to you in your country, get informed as an actual citizen about the politics, about the plans and policies in place, and then vote for what you're hoping for as a citizen. And all the power to you. So thank you so much, Ava. I
Yeah,
really
thank you,
appreciate it.
Tanya. Thanks to Fazana for coordinating this. It was my pleasure.
Of course. Take care. Thank you, everybody, for joining.
Thank you.
Bye.
Bye.